Mr. Robinson, thank you for joining us. Dean Williams and I have been eagerly awaiting your visit here, and we appreciate the fact you've come to the county school. As you look back, you have been a pioneer in many ways as a leader. And going back to your days when you were president of Ireland and the formative experiences you had as president, what did you learn about leadership itself from your perspective? What lessons do you have for others, especially the younger generation who might, there are so many take you as a role model?
I think you have to go back to the presidential campaign, even before it. I had been in Irish political life, first of all as an independent member of the Senate, elected at the age of 25, then as an unsuccessful candidate for the lower house, the politically significant chamber of the Irish Parliament, on 2 occasions. But all of that time I remained a member of the Senate and was re-elected by the graduates of Dublin University, a constituency that was interested in education, liberal issues, reform generally, and that it was a great pleasure to serve. In 1989, in August 1989, after 20 years in the Irish Senate, I retired from public service in order to continue my work as a barrister, as a co-founder of the Centre for Human Rights in Trinity College Dublin with my husband Nicholas, who's also a lawyer. So when I was approached by the Labour Party, it was a complete surprise. I had never considered the presidency. It was a non-executive, honorary office out of the mainstream of life. High up there, you met ambassadors, you ate dinners. I don't know what you did really, but it wasn't something I was interested in. But when I was asked to consider being nominated for the election which would take place the following October, it started a thought process. And I went back to the Irish Constitution and I just looked and I thought, well, you could actually do more with this office. It's a very important office.
You could do more because it was largely a symbolic
It
role.
was very symbolic,
yeah.
And there was that temptation.
But the law permitted you to do more.
Well, there was a practice and a sort of sense that you could do very little. But I didn't think that was right. And I got intrigued. And I remember, I think it was sometime in late August, spending a sleepless night, realizing that my whole life and the life of my family might change. And I really almost panicked. I wasn't sure I wanted this, So I just say this because it was completely different from many campaigns.
Right.
So I came into the presidency on the basis of 6 months of what you could do with the office. What I had to do then for 7 years was show in the doing that this was possible.
I'd read that as a young woman in the 1970s, you were somewhat of an activist lawyer.
Yeah.
It even took on the Catholic Church, I guess, to some degree, in order to get the, laws passed whereby women could have the right to contraception.
Yeah.
But then moving into the role of president, now it was predominantly a symbolic role before you took office, but still it's a formal authority role for a country. You must embody and represent certain values and perspectives and not get out of kilter with the mainstream spirit of the country. Was it difficult holding that kind of authority? Did you feel like you had to compromise your own values in any way because it would not have been prudent to push something to the extreme like you did as a young activist lawyer?
Not really, but it's a good question because I thought about that a lot. First of all, the effect of this campaign was to become more inclusive in my own approach, to open myself and to see that the presidency had to be representative of all of the people. But then there are moments, and there were, when I pushed things to the edge of what I felt was appropriate.
Right. For example?
For example, the debate on divorce referendum. For example, when a 14-year-old had been raped and was trying to go to England for an abortion, and there was a very difficult case. I didn't give my views, but I made it clear that this was an issue that the Irish people really had to think about. We couldn't keep exporting our problem to Britain.
Right.
That was very tough.
Yeah.
And then politically, when I went to West Belfast and shook the hand of Gerry Adams and the heavens fell, that was in 1992, was it? Because I had had a lot of contact. One of the things, again, going back to the reason why I had resigned from the Labour Party on an issue of principle meant that I had very good links of friendship, and I had a credibility with both Catholic and Protestant communities, including inner city communities on both sides.
Right.
And I used the presidency in a non-political way, but the edge was sometimes terribly difficult. And I had many groups from Northern Ireland come to visit me in my residence, very poor people. It was very, very interesting, you know, to see how they did themselves up, and the nervousness, and the cup would shake in the hand until we got to and then by the time they were leaving, they were singing at the door, you know, and that was also part of what it was about. But I'd had so many groups. I had very strong visits to invitations to visit West Belfast, Catholic West Belfast. I'd already been to Northern Ireland a number of times and met many Protestant groups, been to Armagh and so on. And this time I accepted the invitation, knowing that it would involve meeting Gerry Adams.
Yeah.
And such was the publicity about it. It was arranged by this broad constituency of NGOs in West Belfast that I would meet Gerry Adams in private and shake his hand in private.
Right.
Even so, it was all hell broke loose. I was never more criticised.
Did your own advisors say this is going to
Not
be
my
a
own
risky
advisors,
No?
everybody else.
Everybody else.
Yeah, my own advisors were on the wavelength.
So why did you go ahead with it?
Because it was important. You shake the hand of those you want to bring into something, you know. He was very isolated, his people were very isolated. A year later, everybody was shaking his hand.
So you didn't focus exclusively on national issues, you also took on some international issues. And
Yes.
from what I've read, you were the first head of state to visit Somalia after its famine, and also Rwanda in 1994 as well. What prompted you to get involved in those international issues, and particularly with those African countries?
Well, I had been involved in my capacity as a senator, raising these issues in the Irish Senate over 20 years, as an individual, as a lawyer. And when I spoke at my inauguration, I remember quoting James Joyce and saying that I hoped to be the conscience, I can't remember the phrase now.
The smithy of...
Smithy, yes, that's right. And I was actually thinking to myself, how on earth am I going to do this?
Yeah.
You know, but I did want the Irish presidency to be a voice of conscience internationally, because the Irish people had suffered. You know, we had been colonised, we'd struggled for freedom, we had a terrible famine, we were now becoming prosperous. We weren't as prosperous as we now are, but we were becoming prosperous. And surely we must engage.
Yeah.
And symbolically, I must try. And then the issues arose. Somalia arose because Irish development agencies, with whom I'd always had close links before and then supported during the presidency, were working very hard in Somalia, and they were desperate. And they came to see me. And I recall that I contrived that they would, in front of the television cameras, invite me. And then I put that invitation to the government. I couldn't leave the country without the permission of the government.
Right.
So the government then, very reluctantly, for security reasons, agreed that I could go to Somalia. Once I'd done that, I then went 3 times to Rwanda as President of Ireland.
Wow.
And the last time to a wonderful meeting in March 1997 of women, a Pan-African conference, which I referred to just very briefly in Johannesburg, at a meeting of African women. So part of what I try to do is tell the story, tell everybody's story back to them in a way that is affirming if what they're doing is good.
You must have found that, at least ordinarily in politics, if someone tries to bring change, there are other, and you're inevitably going to run into resistance. There are people who are in that area or claim that area who don't want you moving in or don't want to change things. What kind of resistance did you run into? How did you overcome it? What kind of base? You sound like you turned the people into a base of support for you. Popular support gave you the leverage, the power to make change, overcome resistance. But I'm just curious how you saw it.
Well, you know the famous saying, was it Johnson? That the Irish are a very fair people. They never speak well of each other. I mean, there's a fair bit of sniping, and also newspaper sniping.
Yeah.
You know, there have been agendas of trying to undermine, and certainly the constituency was the people, very much so. And it was something that my colleagues when working with me in Áras an Uachtaráin, as it was called, the House of the President. They would always say I was at my happiest when I was out on the road, or out in Somalia, or out in Rwanda,
Right.
and actually interlinking, as opposed to accepting the credentials of ambassadors or presiding at state
You
dinners.
didn't like that stuff.
Well, it was
You had
work,
to do it.
had to do it, but the real work was the intellectual interest Well, first of all, in my first few weeks, I got a lot of requests from these small groups that I've been visiting around the country to come and open a centre or launch a week or, you know, the usual sort of thing. And I was getting this advice from my secretariat of the presidency. This is not an event important enough to warrant the presence of the president. And that was more or less the phrase. This is not an event important enough to warrant the presence of the president. And I kind of, half in jest, but who says? Who decides what's important?
Right. This was the old
And
guard
yeah,
view.
and so I then made it clear that I would decide what was important. They just give me the invitations. Oh, well, there are too many of them. Just give them to me. I'll decide.
Right.
And then I chose strategically very small events in very far-flung places, if they were going to be significant for that area, because I come from the west of Ireland. I'm not a city person. I know how significant it can be if you recognise what really is making a difference in a community. And that's what I tried to do. And I enjoyed doing it very, very much. And I learned so much about Ireland that I didn't know before, about the people of Ireland, in a way that was very enriching. And also, I did something very innovative, half by accident. I linked in the Irish diaspora worldwide. I had been conscious of this during the campaign. I'd met Irish emigrant groups in London. I'd gone across to London during the 6 months and met with them. And on the night of the acceptance speech, which is different from the inauguration, I said I will put a light in the window of Áras an Uachtaráin for all of those who've had to emigrate from Ireland. I had never been in Áras an Uachtaráin, as it happened, just by coincidence. So I didn't know where I would put this light, but it was one of the first decisions we made. And we had thought of a candle, but you can't put a candle. So we got a special light built, and we put it in the window, and I cannot tell you how important that light became.
Really?
And
Why? As a symbol?
Because there are some 70 million people worldwide who feel very strongly their Irish identity. 45 million of them in North America, between Canada and the United States. And I had congressmen, I had President Clinton, I had everybody, and they would go out and look at this light. They would write to me afterwards. I had very distinguished people with tears rolling down their cheeks as they saw this light in the window. So it taught me the importance of symbols, which religions understand.
Yes.
And if you're in a non-executive office, you must use symbols.
That's it. What about the people who were in the executive offices? Did they think you were crowding them to a degree?
They would have preferred not to have such an activist president, there's no doubt about that.
Right.
And they particularly resisted, it was very funny, they particularly resisted me coming on a state visit to the United States. So when Kennedy and, when Bill and Hillary Clinton President Clinton came to Dublin, and they came first of all to pay a courtesy call to Nick and myself. They then planted a tree, which was our custom. Heads of state plant a tree, and as we walked to the planting of the tree, they said, "And when are you coming on the visit?" And we said, "Well, we would love to come, but what about the government?" And I noted that afternoon, when Clinton was addressing a huge gathering in the square in Dublin, he said, "And I have invited President Robinson to pay a state visit." He had to put it out there in that way for it to happen, because Washington was Taoiseach territory. Taoiseach being Irish Prime Minister. Yeah, and and it was a very successful state visit in Irish terms. I mean, it was very, went very well. But both presidents had to fight to have it happen. That's not very well known in Ireland. I'm not sure if I should have said it.
Maybe if we could move on to discuss your role as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Why did you take on that role?
But I really was very keen to work in human rights, and this seemed to be the ideal position. Probably the only position that I could have. So it's either that or something in Europe. So anyway, the Irish government nominated me, ran a very effective campaign, and I was appointed by Kofi Annan in June, was it? June of '97. And
So what was your leadership challenge then coming in? Because you'd been told this was not an easy job, underfunded. What were your thoughts about what you were
I suffered an enormous shock with how bad it was. This was an office created after the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights in 1993. My predecessor, who was the first High Commissioner, took office in March '94. I realised that I can't say why he resigned and went back to Ecuador, but I have a shrewd suspicion. There was a long-standing Centre for Human Rights in Geneva, which had serviced the Commission on Human Rights, which is an intergovernmental commission, and the rapporteurs, and had done a quiet, patient, honourable job of recording and reporting on what human rights was about, very low-key. The Office of High Commissioner was grafted onto that with no thought, no resources, and no real strategy. What I came into was really very hard to explain, but everything was wrong. Everywhere I turned, there were problems and no resources. It was agony. In my first 2 years, I actually realised after a month with my close advisors, you either leave now or you are part of the problem. You're stuck. And there was a real temptation to leave. It was that bad.
Really?
It was so bad. It is incredible to me how in 5 years that was completely transformed. And when I did leave, it was with a huge sense of emotion at withdrawing from such a fine team. The Office of the High Commissioner now is a cracking good team in Geneva, in New York, and in our positions in the field, with incredibly dedicated and skilled and sophisticated human rights activists.
So, in effect, for the second time, you had to reinvent an office.
And it was much more difficult than the presidency. 10 times more difficult. And I can tell you that the climate for human rights within the UN system is not benevolent. Member states are not benevolent about the human rights programme. I'm not saying they're all against it. Some of them are quite strongly for it. But there are enough who are always trying to tie us up in a reporting, tie us up in knots, make it more difficult. It was the most sophisticated business of being ahead of the attempts to stop us from moving forward at all times.
Eventually, you did move forward.
Oh, yes, we did.
I've got this great quote from you. You can tell me whether it's accurate or not, but I read it. It says, "It's frustrating," this is you speaking, "it's frustrating to work within a bureaucracy that's mini-managed, under-resourced, and full of regulations that hamper effectiveness. It requires a lot of patience, and I'm not the most patient person in the world."
I think that's pretty accurate.
So, how did you deal with the UN bureaucracy? How did you deal with the obstructionists when you, by nature, seem to be quite an activist and really want to make things happen?
Well, first of all, I've talked a lot about the frustrations, but there was a gradual building of a good team, and there was a gradual emergence of very good people who were already there in the centre, who began to see that they could show, what they could do. So we began to have a minimal capacity. And then the question was to build on that capacity. I had all kinds of frustrating things. I had some superb human rights lawyers offer to come and work with me free. No, you can't take gratis personnel. We had to try then and get extra budgetary resources to have posts outside the regular budget system. I got very heavily criticised within the UN system for doing that. The controller and others, this is not core work, and you can't have non-core work or core work done by voluntary funded posts, etc. And we had to skim and keep alive, but all the time we were strengthening. And then we had wonderful young people who wanted to come and work for the Office of High Commissioner, and it was. And young interns. We relied a great deal on these.
What kind of people were you looking for? What kind of energy were you trying to create?
There was an obligation, which I actually fully support, to have complete geographical balance as well as gender balance. I was able to do a great deal more on the gender balance. The office went from being not very good on gender balance to being one of the best units within the UN system on gender balance. That was easier than the geographical balance, because you need high quality in human rights postgraduate degrees for particularly the more significant jobs. So it was quite difficult to get African, Asian, less so Latin American, and to keep that balance. So I was constantly being criticised for that. It's a very complex jigsaw at all times. When you advertise a key post, you will not fill it within a year. There's no way you'll fill it within a year, no matter what you do. You can scream and jump up and down and do anything like that, but I can tell you the bureaucracy, because I had to work through the bureaucracy of the UNOG, as it's called in Geneva. I was secretariat. I didn't have my own agency. I was part of the secretariat, so I had to go through a layer of UNOG in Geneva, and a lair in New York before any post was filled, and it would kill you.
Goodness.
It sounds as if, as you did as president, that your passion, your moral stance, and your charisma helped pull people behind you, who then support you and give you strength and enlarge your capacity as leader.
Yeah.
That there was a similarity in one point to one.
I would say actually in a funny way, it was the other way round in some ways, that I would be very frustrated at the bureaucracy, and then I would go to Colombia, where we have an office in Bogota,
Yeah.
and I would see our human rights colleagues doing superb human rights work at risk to their lives, with huge commitment, and then I would go, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Sierra Leone, to Cambodia, and see the same sort of thing, or meet the courageous special rapporteurs who went on country visits. And I was very inspired by what they were doing, and I was determined, because I'm a very stubborn person, this has to be made more resourced. We have to make sense of this. It is so important. So it was more I learned from them.
What's it like trying to get things done, to exercise leadership, when the issues are so hot and the dynamics and the factions are all out there resonating to their own particular concerns? It looks to me like sometimes you're like walking a tightrope, and you don't know whether you're going to fall off, and you've got people throwing stuff at you, trying to get you to fall over. I think of the World Conference on Racism, and certainly some other events where you took a lot of heat, and maybe the human rights agenda to some degree was attacked, or you were certainly undermined. Did it feel like you were being undermined? Did it feel like you were being attacked? What's it like in those very difficult situations?
Well, when you were asking the question, what came to my mind was Chechnya, because that was really very difficult. First of all, to try to get to Chechnya, because the situation had been worsening over the particular winter, and I had asked to go. First of all, I had raised it, and then I had asked to visit, and it was being resisted by the Russians, and then Putin was elected, and he was making a big thing that part of his reason for being elected was he was going to take on the whole Chechnya. We kept getting these reports about human rights issues, and eventually, when the Human Rights Commission had already started, and I'm supposed to be there during its 6 weeks as head of the secretariat that supports the Intergovernmental Commission, but when it had already started, the Russians said, all right, you can come for a visit. And the first thing was, do I take up the invitation? If I do, what can I do?
Yeah.
So I decided to take it up, went to Ingushetia, went to Grozny and Chechnya itself. It was quite dangerous. And then, at the insistence of the Russians, went to Dagestan, because they wanted me to hear that side of it, and came back to Russia, to Moscow. I was a hated figure in Moscow. I was hearing these stories that I was the great white witch, and so on. And then I had to bring that back to the Commission on Human Rights and seek to convince them to pass a resolution against a P5 country, permanent 5 country, which had never happened before. And we had to work very hard to put the story together, and we were tired. And I remember just it being so important to tell the human story.
Right.
And that was what made the difference in the Commission. There was a silence as they listened to what the Memorial Human Rights organization, a very brave Russian organization which works in Chechnya and on behalf of the Chechen people, which is an extraordinary outreach of human rights. And they had lined up a number of witnesses for me, and I just told what those witnesses had told me straight, flat.
Right.
And I remember the New York Review of Books carried it afterwards, and I was very moved that they did, because that gave it much wider circulation. But that was my report to the Commission, and then they voted, and for the first time Russia was condemned in a resolution, and that was a really important step. And the Russians never forget. They weren't actually. The Russians did forgive me in a sense, because we also had a big technical cooperation program, and in my last year, I had good relations with the Russians, despite continuing to raise Chechnya.
Right.
So that was good. But the other most difficult thing, in a different way, was this World Conference in Durban. I always knew it was going to be. I tried an initiative during the Millennium Summit of a declaration on diversity, and I decided that we would have a text which a number of us worked on, and I even had the help of some poets and philosophers in writing it. And I needed somebody to give me the support, and I rang up Nelson Mandela, whom I had met a number of times on state visits to South Africa, and he'd come to Geneva and everything. And I said to him, you know, first of all, when I got him on the end of the phone, he said, "Ah, Mary, I thought you'd forgotten me." Which is, so I mean, immediately he said, "Yes, I will support." So he was the patron of it. I also was signing it as Secretary General of the World Conference, and then each head of state was to sign it, starting with Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki signed it in New York. We had about 70 heads of state who signed that, and I was trying to lift from what I knew was going to be the infighting between the governments, particularly on the Middle East issue.
Right.
And in fact, that was where problems set in the preparatory conference in Tehran. Inappropriate language, Zionism as racism and all the rest of it, was put in brackets, as happens in these world conferences, in Tehran. There was nothing I could do about it. I wasn't even part of the negotiations. I was Secretary General, helpless as this went in, and those governments who could have done more just weren't at the table at the right time, and the text went in brackets. And then we carried on, and the atmosphere became more and more polluted, if you like. At a certain stage, in the last preparatory meeting in Geneva in late August, the conference was to take place at the end of August, beginning of September. This was middle August, say. I made a statement which put my head above the parapet, which I said, it is absolutely essential that all language about Zionism as racism and everything else comes out, but it is inevitable that there will be some reference to the Middle East conference, because I knew conflict, because I knew there was no way we could have no reference. Yeah. It was what kind of reference, but none of this language. And I was criticised for doing that by certain countries, including this country, because I should have been a civil servant. You know, you either try to give leadership, or either way you were going to be shot. Anyway, we arrive in in Durban, and in many ways, and it's too long a story, in many ways it was one of the most positive experiences. There were wonderful things that happened in Durban. The civil society, indigenous peoples, those of African descent, the Roma in Europe, had the best conference of their lives. Yeah. And that was fantastic. And in the end, we got all the dirt out. We got all the bad text out. Yeah. And we got a declaration and programme of action by consensus. And Shimon Peres praised it the next day and said Israel had won. There was nothing in the text they need to worry about. Yeah. For some reason, for various reasons, that is not the perception of this country. Right. It is a very positive experience in Latin America, for example. I attended a month ago, when was I in Mexico? Doesn't matter, either was it early August or July of this year, the first of the follow-up conferences, follow-up seminars to Durban, and country after country, Brazil, prepared very well for Durban, has addressed the black Brazilian problem, is very positive about it. Mexico, for the first time, really crunched on the indigenous people's problem. Chile, a totally positive message. Yeah. And there was one group that had represented Jewish concerns in Durban and had been very vocal about the anti-Semitism. There was rife anti-Semitism in Durban, which was awful. Yeah. But they came to Mexico and they tried to reopen that. And people said, look, forget it. Yeah. That has nothing to do with what we are about in addressing these issues. And the office just had a week ago a very good follow-up in Africa. Since Durban, of course, we've had a rise in anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, and we've had also a coarsening of language in relation to refugees, asylum seekers, those of Arab background or South Asian, etc. And we need the Durban agenda more than ever, but it's very difficult. We've tried in our office to give the leadership and to prioritise, but probably our greatest problem is in this country and in Israel itself. People aren't reading the text. Right. They're just assuming that nothing good could have come out of Durban because they had left.
How difficult is it to be a leader in an international organization now, because you are in effect a civil servant, at least you're seen that way by various powerful countries. How difficult is it to assert and then actually make progress on some of these really troublesome issues facing the world now, as poverty or racism, what have you? with these great, powerful bodies of nations that really have their own politics. And just what does it take? Kofi Annan seems to have succeeded where many others have not. I'm just trying. I'm trying to figure out why do some people succeed at these jobs and some fail? What are the differences?
I think it is very difficult because you're constantly reminded that you are a civil servant. And I traced the real focus of the office that I held of High Commissioner, and that it, of all the positions in the UN, serves the first three words of the Charter, we the peoples. And you take some stick on that, but you serve we the peoples. But I think part of where I saw a blossoming and a capacity of our office to really make an impact was because we had developed a capacity. And I saw that in an extraordinarily positive way in the last World Conference that I attended, which was at Johannesburg on sustainable development. Whether it was on access to clean water, on HIV/AIDS, on development, on environment, on corporate responsibility, I had huge things to say. Not because I had invented them or I was brilliant or anything, but because my office had done the homework and was a professional thing. The same thing with Kofi Annan. He has professional people around him. He has people who write good speeches for him. And he's a good leader in that sense. But it's a team effort. I don't think anybody, certainly in this capacity, does it as a solo. You do it because you've got a team, and you are the front for very good people.
And when you face something like the authority, the power, the status of a country like the United States saying, no, we do not want to go that way. Is that like a great big boulder standing up in front of you, or some huge giant standing in front of you? How do you deal with that?
It certainly wasn't easy, and I must say I regretted that it became a very sharp issue, especially when I spoke out about the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and indeed in Afghanistan itself, and the holding of people for long periods in this country. I kept trying to answer journalists' questions by always saying, but the great strength of the United States is that the sharpest criticism is coming from within the United States. This actually wasn't true for the first couple of months, but it became very true with Lawyers Committee and Amnesty, etc. And that to never criticize the United States, to have difficulties with a particular administration. But there's a great country that shows the...
Yeah, do you sort of learn to work your way through the U.S.? Okay, here's the Secretary of State, and he's in one position, somebody else in another position, and you sort of learn how to play off each other.
Certainly in the preparations for Durban, I had very good discussions initially, particularly with Colin Powell. But unfortunately, when things became more difficult, I didn't get to see Colin Powell. You get stopped at an earlier stage, and then you can't plead directly in the way that you might like to. And I regretted that, because I think it would have been very good for him and very good for the United States if he had come to Durban. And I think we would have got the result we got, and he would have got credit for it. But it's a different
wonderful statement from you. You can tell me whether it's accurate again or not. You say, I haven't suffered from a frustration about being politically bullied, because I will not be bullied. I've always stood up to bullies. Is that your sense in your career, in your life, that you've really had to stand up to a lot of nonsense, be it in Ireland or in the world, and that as a female and as a leader, that it's critical to stand for something and don't let this go on or overwhelm you?
Yes, in fact, one of the first bullies I had to stand up to was a cardinal in Ireland.
Right.
Yeah.
That was tough. No, you have to, and I think it helped in my position as High Commissioner that I had held high political office. So when I was standing up also as somebody, I've been a head of state.
Right.
Don't you tell me, and that helped. And they inherently respected that above all else in the UN system. Yeah. And it also helped politically in China, for example. I made great progress in China because they respected me as a former head of state. And I had very interesting meetings with Jiang Zemin. Right. And he would say, well, of course, you've been in this position. And the difference between being executive president of a small 3.5 million population and being the president of a 2.6 billion population. Right. But he was on a couple of times, he said that at different times. So the entree of high office, but also the capacity to stand up more. But I think the reason I was able to do it was because I had to do it in a much more difficult circumstances very early on and pay a price. And that was one of the things that I learned. If you really want to make progress in life, be prepared. If you have principles that you want to stand for, be prepared to pay a price, because there will be one.
Right.
Final question. What advice for young women who aspire to be leaders of their country or indeed leaders of the world? How should they become leaders? What should they do?
It's very difficult. What I find is that young women now are so much more confident, and that's great. So they already start from a different base, and that confidence is very important. I think what I would encourage them to do is whatever they want to do it from the strength of being a woman. Recognise those strengths. Be a rounded woman in what you're doing. It's a great strength, and you bring qualities and insights and practical skills, and be innovative. If you're whatever you're doing, don't feel that you have to do it the way it was done. Look at it again.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very impressed by the confidence of women now.
We're certainly considering for a moment completing a second term as President of Ireland. Did you consider for a moment completing your second term as the Human Rights Commissioner? And if not, well, the reality is that you have just completed 1 year of that second term. Why didn't you complete it? Why didn't you stay on? What was, you don't, obviously there's a lot of personal reasons around that, but give us some insight into that decision-making process where you feel like I can be more effective in this area or that area, and so you have that, you're confronted with that fork in the road and have to make that choice.
Well, as I explained, I had not intended to serve a second term, partly because the first 4-year term had started off being extremely difficult.
Right.
My family had paid a huge price. They could see the toll it took on me, and then the office had been strengthened to a certain point, and I felt I could hand it over
Right.
and work in other areas. I was quite taken aback by the extent of the dismay in the human rights community, particularly grassroots groups I'd never even heard of, who wrote in emails, and then Secretary General Kofi Annan put pressure, and I agreed to do a further year. I've never been so happy to have been persuaded, because
Right.
it was the best year, and it was an important year to do after the 11th of September, after Durban and so on. That, as far as I was concerned, was going to be it, and then I appreciated that we all knew that the situation was more difficult after the 11th of September,
Right.
and that there was more pressure, more difficulties in human rights, and I began to come under a lot of pressure to consider staying on for a further term. My family were not happy about this,
Right.
but I did indicate to the SG that if he felt it was necessary, that I would be prepared to. I think he thought about it,
Yeah.
and then he concluded that we would continue with the situation as it was publicly on the record that I would end in September. I am aware that the United States administration made it perfectly clear that I would not be acceptable. I'm not aware of any other government making it clear, to be honest. I've heard that others, but I'm told by the Russians and I'm told by the Chinese
Yeah.
that they would have been happy for me to continue, which is interesting.
Right.
Mm.
But the United States did not want you to continue.
Not the administration, no.
From what you understand, did they put pressure on Kofi Annan to say, right, tell
They
us
certainly made it very clear.
They made it clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as I say, from a personal point of view, they probably did me a favour in one way, in the sense that I am ready now to move to the next stage. And
Yes.
we had an extremely good transition
Mm.
to my successor, Sergio Vieira de Mello, because it was an important part of my approach
Yeah.
that the office would be the sustainable way forward,
Right.
and that we would do everything to have a very efficient and good transition. There was a lot of sadness. I was very moved by what my colleagues said and what the human rights community generally said, but I felt a great peace of mind myself, a great sense of satisfaction, and also, having had a holiday now in Mayo, I feel very energised about the future. I mean, I have a lot to bring now into a wider sphere.
And you'll continue to be involved with human rights
Continue to be involved
on a
in human
global
rights.
scale, globalisation and other
Yeah.
issues as well.
But as a private citizen.
As a private citizen.
Well, as a, we hope we can draw you back one of these days to talk about leadership as a private citizen. That's